Welcome to Exploring the Role of AI in Education and the Workplace.
We're two classroom teachers on a mission to make artificial intelligence less intimidating and more inspiring for educators everywhere.
Whether you're just curious about what AI can do or already experimenting with it in your classroom, this podcast is your space to explore, learn, and grow.
Each episode features a two-part format. First, we sit down with industry experts to unpack a key aspect of AI, from infrastructure and ethics to creativity and integration.
Then we bring it back to the classroom with a boots on the ground segment, real conversations with educators who are actively using AI with students.
We'll bring you practical insights, honest dialogue, and real-world examples to help you think critically and creatively about the role of AI in teaching and learning.
I'm Georgia Terlahi, a former K-5 instructional coach and an educator who's passionate about tech integration and sparking curiosity in students.
And I'm Jessica Pack, a middle school teacher, education author, and former California Teacher of the Year. My passion is creating compelling learning experiences.
So let's dive in and discover how AI can empower educators and transform classrooms, one episode at a time.
Today, we are joined by Dr. Joseph Wilson, Brian Greiwe, and Emma Moss. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules and lives and careers to join us today. We are so appreciative of your time and your expertise. Could you maybe briefly each introduce yourself and kind of give us a rundown on the context in which you work and how that is in conjunction with education? Let's go ahead and start with Emma, if we can.
Yeah, excited to be here. My name's Emma Moss, and I am a digital teaching and learning specialist in Canyon School District. I also am the AI systems lead for our school district, as well as done some work for the state with the AI for K-12 rollout. And so really coming from a ground up perspective, we were one of the first school districts in the state to have a framework around AI for all of our stakeholders and how to integrate that into different spaces. And now have done a lot of leadway and headwork on what do those examples look like in a classroom? What's actually happening, gone in and done observations, and specifically looking at what does this look like in our STEM classrooms and how are educators applying that? So really connecting in both spaces and seeing across the state. So excited to contribute to this conversation today.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wilson?
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. I'm Joey Wilson. I'm a managing director at the American Institutes for Research, which is an 80-year-old research nonprofit based in DC. I live in San Francisco, so I'm at the heart of the AI epicenter. I wear a couple of different hats. One is I lead our AI steering committee for AIR, which means I think a lot about how do we bring AI into the way we do our work, how do we upskill our staff. And the other hat that I wear is I run a Center for Computer Science Education. So I think a lot about how do we bring AI and computer science into schools. I'm a former high school science teacher, and so I always love working with teachers. And any chance I get to see what's happening within schools and within school districts, I love that. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. And last but not least, Brian, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Glad to be here. I'm Brian Greiwe. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Project Lead the Way. And for those not familiar, we are a nationwide nonprofit that provides STEM education from pre-K to 12th grade, teaching transportable skills and career readiness. So we've been around for 28 years. Obviously, being in technology, we look at internally what we can use for AI for our offerings to our students and our teachers, but also how we can do those as team members to accelerate our work and our mission.
Thank you so much for all of you being here today. I'm excited for this conversation. So to start us off, Brian, I'm going to start with you. And then if Emma and Joey, you want to jump in and add, please do. So when you look at the near future, which AI tools or platforms do you think will make the biggest difference for STEM teachers when it comes to lesson planning and instructional design? Brian, what do you think?
Well, that's a great question, because when you look at the landscape, you've got the big players out there. You've got the Chat GPTs, Copilot, Gemini from Google, and then you've got a lot of in-market players. So Magic School, PlayLab, and those kind of tools. Obviously, Google has a big footprint in the K-12 space. And I think if you look at what they do with Gemini and how they're really focusing in on what they can offer there and in their Google Classroom and how things integrate, I think one thing that's very unique is all three of these, plus others, they allow you to create your own custom GPTs or GEMs or agents, and you can train those in pedagogy and resources, and then kind of use those throughout your work, throughout your day, throughout your week. And it learns as you go, and it can then produce for you based on your voice, your parameters. And so I think those tools are going to be pretty powerful. And I do think that obviously Google has that bigger footprint, but I also like these other market players that are coming in that aren't necessarily the big public or GPTs and AIs that are out there, because I think those can provide some more focused security and be trained better when it comes to education and the pedagogy that we need in the K-12 classroom.
Great. That's a lot to think about. But that's what we're trying to do is we're trying to break it down for teachers and educators that maybe are still like, I don't even know where to start with any of this. Emma or Joey, anything you'd like to add with that about which AI tools do you think will make the biggest difference in STEM for teachers?
I really loved how Brian was talking about like these education specific tools. I think that for teachers and your comment about how with those teachers, like how do I get started? Those educational tools really can provide an entry point. They have a lot of scaffolding in place. So if you're like, I don't know where to start with AI, a lot of them have those tools pre-built and then you can customize them from there. So specifically with lesson planning, there's a lesson plan tool inside of that. A teacher doesn't have to do anything besides go in there, put in some standards, talk about what they want, and then they can go in and actually critically analyze with their lens of how do I do this in my classroom without feeling overwhelmed by that entry point into the AI tool. And so I feel like those education specific tools really are going to have a large impact on the landscape because they allow for educators to have the entry point into the space, to then maybe progress to some of these bigger players like your Googles or your Chat GPTs, and they have the safety precautions in place. And so it kind of allows that playground for educators, and especially for STEM educators, where they are often like with hands-on work and going in and integrating, that space is just made and built for them to be able to connect.
I can jump in and say, similar to what Emma was mentioning, I think the big players that run the large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, all of it, those are a nice entry point. But I do wish that there were more specialized tools within that are trained on high quality instructional materials for STEM teachers. I think right now, it's easy to just put something right on top of ChatGPT. Or Gemini on top of it and create lesson plans. However, it's not clear where some of this information comes from. And there's growing body of evidence that's showing that, the internet itself is becoming a slop of AI generated content. And so, does the tail eat its own head with some of this? So I think AI tools that are specifically designed for standards aligned, high quality instructional materials are super important. And then I think on the other side of it, not from instructional design, but from teacher practice and teacher reflection, I think there are some emerging set of tools and platforms that are supporting teacher coaches and thinking about looking at videos of teacher instruction and seeing what sort of practices are in play and automatically supporting the process for teacher coaches to provide input and provide feedback for teachers, I think is another really powerful part of that could be used could leverage AI with it.
I definitely think that, it's such a learning curve right now for teachers. It's not very intuitive for many of us to just jump into AI. So how are companies working to make AI tools more intuitive for teachers who maybe don't have a strong technical background? Because, everyone's at a different place with educational technology in general, but this is just it's not a zone of comfort for many educators. So what should they be looking for in tools that would help them?
For me, the first thing I think they're really going to look at, and I think I'd be honest about saying this, is looking at safety to make sure AI uses data differently. So instead of just like a Google search where you're putting information in and you're getting information out, it is some of our models, if they're not set up in a specific way, will train and learn from that data. And so, especially in the education space where you have student data that you may be working with or sensitive information of any kind, it's really looking at that first. And then I think the next step when you're looking at integrating is where is it supporting you along your journey? You talked about sometimes AI isn't as intuitive for educators, but I think when you start to shift from looking at it as just like I'm looking for information to either a thought partner or moving into a process of understanding some basics of how AI is designed, it really helps continue that conversation. AI is designed to be conversational. And so as educators, we're really good at giving and getting feedback, right? That's how we work with students. It's what makes a good educator to say like, hey, this is where you need to grow. And that same conversational process needs to happen with AI. And I think especially for STEM, it's understanding that maybe it may not have as much training data in the background for STEM, but knowing that you as an educator do. When I talk about AI, I always talk about it really should amplify who you are as an educator. And so when you're looking for a tool, look for something that's safe and then look for something that's going to help amplify that ability for you. If that's a tool that after you ask the question shows up at the bottom and gives you suggested prompts, or if that's a tool that's more open-ended because you want that creativity piece, something like Google's image generator with Nano Banana, like depending on where you're at, but finding that space that feels comfortable to you, I think kind of lowers that barrier to then take those next steps and be able to empower you to do what's going to be best to support your students, which really is bringing in your teacher expertise and pairing that with the power of AI.
I don't think I could agree more with Emma when it comes to safety being one of the top priorities for schools and teachers when it comes to using AI. The whatever is happening with the data that you put in, whether it's going out to a model to train it or if it's being secured, that's really something to keep in mind. I think first and foremost, when it comes to getting teachers comfortable with AI, it's the education and training of those teachers for AI. And not just reading about it, watching videos about it, but hands-on applications so they can try it themselves, get comfortable, know what's going on with it. And I think that's really important. At Project Lead the Way, we launched a Demystifying AI course a while back just to help get teachers ramped up. We may be getting to a point where demystifying AI is not necessary, but now having practical implications and using AI is necessary. So I think that training, whether it's training through organizations like us or others, or training given by the companies that are providing the AI tools, I think that's really important. I also have seen with some of the tools that are out there, especially those in specifically in education, they've worked with teachers to try to get user input from the user experience on there. And I've seen some where they provide templates or playbooks that make it really easy for a teacher to go step by step to understand what he or she needs to do in the classroom. You may be familiar with Ethan Mollick and his 4 principles of AI. And one of them is when you work with AI to treat it as a human, but realize it's not. And when you work with AI, if you tell it the persona it's supposed to be, you tend to get better results. Not always, but you tend to get better results. And so in some of these tools, it just walks the teacher through, who do you want this AI to be? What's the persona? What's the activity that's going on? And I think those simplifications of those steps really goes a long way to allow teachers to be more comfortable in the classroom.
I was just gonna mention, I think many of the tools that exist right now have a very low barrier to entry. And I think there's working in the computer science education space, I see a lot of similarities between just computer science education and when we talk about AI literacy, where we didn't have teachers who were trained in computer science. We didn't have teachers who were trained in artificial intelligence, partially because it just wasn't. Chat GPT really blew it out of the water several years ago, where it became this all-purpose, general-purpose tool that people are thinking about it. And I think being able to have someone who is like at your school to hold your hand a little bit with it, I think is a really important part to get those folks who are reticent to use an AI tool to start to see how it plays out. But I think before you can do that, I think you need to have some foundational understanding of, when we say AI, what do we mean? And so, for instance, the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, when they talk about how students might learn AI, they separate it into K through 5, 6 through 8, 9 through 12. And K through 5, they focus on learning about AI, but not with AI. And I actually feel like there's a little bit of content about AI itself that is really necessary, so then that teachers can critically think about how the tools are operating. And there's a lot of resources that exist, like there's a National Science Foundation funded project called AI for K-12 that breaks apart AI into these 5 big ideas. that I think give teachers a good sense of when we talk about AI, what we mean, because I think teachers will talk about AI, but it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so I think clarifying when we say AI, if you're talking about just generative AI, or are you talking about something different, is really important.
I was just going to jump in here and say, in my role in Canyon School District, that's one of the things that we did early on was establish a framework to kind of provide those foundational blocks. We call it the VIEW. So the V acronyms in education was a value of understanding, covering what AI is, how AI works, and how does this apply to your role. And then I looking at implementing safely. What are those safety precautions you need to have in place? What do you need to check for? And then looking at the educational value. How does this apply to your context? What are best promising practices that we're seeing? And then going to world preparation. How is this going to impact students moving forward into a world that is going to be, and quite honestly, is already very different? And seeing that laid out, it's hard because I think with AI right now, with most other educational technology that's come about, we can really focus on just the function of the tool. You just teach, how does this work? But AI, it's different, that you need the foundation in place before you can understand the full capabilities of the function. And I think especially when you're working with educators, there's a lot of apprehension, and there was at the beginning, of like, is this cheating if I use this? Like, how can I use this? Where do I use this? And trying to help them see, like, this is how it's functioning. And it helped amplify, oh, now that I understand how this works, I can start seeing how I can apply it as the content expert in my spaces. And yeah, some of those things are just addressing with them what it can do, and some of those limitations, things like bias or hallucinations, or how to get it to produce sources and then check the sources if those are accurate, right? But that foundational piece is so necessary because the technology is so new. I was having a conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago, but they talked about how with Henry Ford, everyone had horses. And if you would have asked people what they wanted, they would have said they wanted a faster horse because they didn't understand what was capable with the car. And I think that's the shift we're trying to move from in a technology space, is from horses to cars, but we're doing it at a rate that is so much faster that it's figuring out what foundational pieces are absolutely necessary so that you can start to make that transition and integrate in a way that works and is again, empowering your educators to take what they already do so well and then be assisted or amplified and supported by AI as a tool.
You mentioned something about how teachers were saying, is this cheating? And I remember I was chatting with an elementary teacher a couple weeks ago, and they were kind of comparing the use of new AI tools as like the graphing calculator or a connection to Wikipedia. And is it cheating if you use Wikipedia? I distinctly remember when I was teaching, you had to think critically about whether or not you could use Wikipedia as a source for it. And now, for many people, Wikipedia is the original primary source to get access to information. And I feel there's a corollary here too. With AI, it's like a new way of accessing information very quickly, and trying to think about how can we use it critically and evaluate the outputs of it in ways that we haven't thought of is new, and it's scary, and it's exciting, and it's all those things all at once. Everything, everywhere, all at once is like the part of it.
And I love, Emma, that you like the visual of the Henry Ford in the car and the people with horses, because that's kind of how I've thought with it. I wasn't around with Henry Ford, but it makes me think about it. Well, because we've run across people that like, well, I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm not going to deal with AI. I don't want to. I'm like, well, if you think back to the car, like, there were some people that were like, I'm not going to do the car. I'm just going to keep driving my horse. And then at some point you have to make the change because it's just not practical. So I think some of those visualizations are helpful, especially for people that aren't in this space like we are, that are just trying to navigate all of it. I know we touched a little bit on data privacy as being a big concern. I was just wondering, what kinds of safeguards do you think need to be built into the AI tools so we can protect students while still allowing for personalized learning? Brian, have you like noodled around with this at all? What do you think should be built in?
Well, I think first and foremost, there needs to be transparency from the tools. The user needs to understand what is happening with the data. Some tools, and Emma's alluded to this already, some tools are already built safe, and you know that your data is not going to go out into a public model and train it, but other tools aren't, or other tools don't disclose that information. So I think that's probably the most important safeguard, is for each of these tools or companies to be very transparent about what happens to the data that you upload and that you use in the AI. But outside of that, general guardrails, right? In the education space, student data is vital, right? It is. We need to protect it. We need to keep it safe and secure. You can put guardrails in, whether you're building your own AI, building on top of something that already exists. You can use what's retrieval augmented generation. You can make sure some data that you put out there is stored separately from the model and not put back into the model. But as we look at AI from PLTW standpoint, what we may or may not do with our curriculum and as students interact with it, that's one thing that we're really looking at. What guardrails are most important out there? How can we ensure that the data that's uploaded stays where it's at and doesn't go into one of the large language models that's out there? And then other guardrails that need to be put in place is just the normal use or potential abuse of AI, right? You put this kind of tool in front of somebody, they're going to try to see what it will do and what it won't do. Putting filters on the front, or even putting it's known as a LLM as a judge on the back end to ensure that the response that comes back is an appropriate response for the user, or that the response is treating the data accurately. So before even the user sees something, there's a technology check. I still would say the human in the loop, the person reviewing the output is still very important, but you could add some safeguards along the way to ensure that there's better quality and better safety before it gets back out to the user.
Can I just jump in real quick? And I just want to know, for those educators that are listening, we're using some really big words here. Can I break a couple of those down real quick? Because I feel like for the general educator that's listening to this, we're using words like model and training and LLM, and I don't know the experience of the audience, but I think, and we can clip part of this if you want to, but I think it's worth noting as to what those things are and why it's a little bit different. That when we're talking about those models, what we're saying is a particular program or software like a ChatGPT or Google Gemini, or like a Microsoft Copilot. These are different types of models, and those models have been trained. So they've taken tons of different types of data, and that is how it produces an output for you. And so when we're talking about training a model, it's taking these large data sets, training, giving you an output. But for you as a user, some of those are set up in a way that it is, when you sign up, you are giving permission for them to train on the inputs you put in. So instead of having like where you used to just sign up for an account on a website and you get like your name and your email and your birthday, now it's coming in and it's actually learning from that material. Similar to how we have a learning process, that once that data is in there and it's learned, it's very difficult to pull it out of a system. And so that is part of the reason that we're bringing up safety so much, is because it's different than what's happened in the past, is because it's learning and making new connections, just like your brain would. That training is a very interesting thing, but you have to determine if what you're putting in, if you're sharing it with you, if you're okay with that. And in the education space where there's person identifiable information and student data, that becomes something as educators that we really have to be aware of. And so as we're talking about models and training, this is why we're focusing on it, is because AI is a little bit different than some of the other things that we've experienced in the past.
This is one part of AI tools I feel really strongly that models and tools that work with students and student data for those who are under 18 should not train the general model. Like, I think full stop, just shouldn't do it at all. It should not be allowed. When I do research, when I do educational research, you have to get active participation and active consent in order to collect data, in order to do this. And in the world of AI, data is currency. And in this case, without having a parameter or a guardrail that says that we're not going to use these student data or the way that students are engaging with an AI tool, you're effectively giving free data and free currency to companies about what's going on, how students are using it. I think there's a lot of evidence that can come out of these tools, and I think we have to better understand like how it happens, but it needs to be done in a way that has active consent of parents.
I think we're all really sort of cognizant of the fact that we're teaching a variety of grade levels, and we're talking about the spectrum of K-12. And I like what you're saying about just 18 and under, it shouldn't even be part of the training process. And for a lot of teachers, this is new to think about at all, that this would be a concern. So thank you for those perspectives. From an industry standpoint, what strategies could help educators ensure that their use of AI tools remains human-centered, supporting those teacher-student relationships rather than trying to like replace them? Do you have thoughts on that? Brian, could we maybe start with you?
I think there is a lot. When I think of just not education, I think of business. There's some fear about what AI will do to jobs, to careers, to relationships. I think it's important to remember that AI is a tool. It's not magic. It's math, and it's an algorithm that tries to predict what is going to happen or be said next, and then it's how it gives you information back. When I think about the student-teacher relationship, or even we talked just a minute ago about some people thought that maybe using AI could be cheating, right? It's helping me do my job in a way that I didn't know before. It's a technology and it can do something for you, but just because it can do really cool and good things doesn't mean it's always right. So when I think about using AI in the classroom, especially how teachers interact with students, to help overcome some of the fears of should a student be using AI? How is the AI being used? I would look at strategies that engage students with AI, whether it's challenging them to input a prompt, a question, or an activity, get the output back, and then have a person-to-person discussion about what that output is. Is it accurate? What's good about it? What's bad about it? How might it change? How could you ask this differently? So that it promotes critical thinking and problem solving, which is something we definitely don't want to get away from as humans. If we just put everything we have into prompts and let the AI give us information back, then you kind of think of this dystopian world of WALL-E, where humans don't really do much but sit down and watch. I think teachers can be very active and engaged with students by doing those kind of prompt work with them and asking them their critical thoughts on that. And I think that helps demystify and maybe alleviate some of the fears of breaking that student-teacher relationship.
I'm going to go ahead and give you another visual that I've used that I think is really helpful when talking about AI in this space. Oftentimes when we talk about AI, we talk about it being like a tool, and we think about it like a hammer. That's a tool, and it doesn't take a whole lot of skill to use a hammer. You just pick it up and you hit stuff. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to move AI from just being a tool to being an instrument. When you think about an instrument, you might think of like a doctor with a scalpel, or like a musician playing a violin, and that requires more technique and skill and process. And so what we're trying to say is, what processes do you need in place to be able to teach your students to use AI like they're playing a violin versus they're using a hammer? And what you've just related to with the critical thinking is a lot of where that is. And on a ground level in the school districts that I'm in, a lot of times that's coming back to a conversation. AI can do a lot of incredible things, but how are we continuing to talk and converse about it? We're talking about K-12 here, but I've seen examples in every area. There's one particular example that I went into a kindergarten classroom where the teacher was modeling. The AI tool made a rap battle between Henry Ford and the Wright brothers, and it used a particular vowel blending sound, but she was very transparent with the kindergartners and had them doing things like saying, I need to think for myself. And so she said, here's the thing. How does this match what we already know about vehicles? And I was like, yes, because these were 5-year-olds that were like, the car is driving. That's right. And she's like, how do you know that? They're like, because I've driven a car. Like, obviously these are 5-year-olds, but like those kind of things, bringing it back to that student talk piece of how do we talk about what we're doing, and then integrating it into those pedagogical practices that teachers already know. Like, if you're a STEM teacher, you know how to teach STEM. So how do you take this instrument and have it amplify something that you're already doing to not limit that human connection, but create more space for that human connection? because that's what we want to come back to is I noticed that you mentioned it, but keeping the human in the loop in the process, that that human creativity and agency has to persist regardless of what option or model you're utilizing.
I really like what you both were saying, especially around critical thinking and communication discussion. I think that is like an absolutely essential component of teaching with AI and teaching about AI. So one of the 5 big ideas of from the AI for K-12 framework is societal impact. And its statement is AI can impact society in both positive and negative ways, is the way that it's described. And I think being able to talk about this at different levels. So what you talk about in K through 2 will look different than in 3 through 5, than in 6 through 8, and 9 through 12, and it increases the complexity and the nuance. And I think especially in the elementary grades, you can engage with conversations about AI through storytelling, connecting it to one of the projects that I lead with North Carolina State University is called AI by 8, where we're focused on K through 2 educators and thinking about how do you use English language arts instruction to teach about AI in an unplugged way. So giving teachers the tools and the conversation and the instructional materials to start to introduce students about AI, so that by the time they actually do use tools later on, they have a sense of what these big concepts, when we talk about AI, what does that mean? And it's not a new thing where they're just jumping in and they're just using the tool and they don't have any context for what is underneath it.
And I think, Joey, that kind of like mirrors what Emma was saying, like with the musician. That's like when you start playing, like I took piano lessons for a million years. You start with scales. You're not even playing anything that makes any sense. But then by the time you get to playing something, it all starts to make sense. And you're glad you had that foundational piece to get there. So I think that those are really great like visuals to help people navigate this. I want to look at kind of the big picture for a few minutes. And I know it's kind of hard because it's ever evolving and ever changing, but looking ahead, what kind of partnerships between industry and education do you see as most important for scaling AI responsibly in schools? Brian, can you start us off?
I think we've touched on a couple things already. We touched on having some sort of curriculum aligned or pedagogy aligned tool set to use. I'm going to have to borrow some of Emma's language. I like the use of instrument. That does go a long way over a tool. But I think looking at creating more and deeper curriculum aligned tool sets in AI for teachers to use that with standards and scaffolding included in there. I think a couple other things that are really important, though, is when you look at industry and education working together, we know that the future of work is going to change. AI is dramatically going to change, enhance, accelerate the kind of work that these students do when they get out of their education journey. So creating workforce readiness pipelines, industry working with classrooms to say, hey, here's a potential job. Here are the kinds of things that you may be using AI for in the next 5-10 years, whatever that might look like, so that kids can see this, right? They can start imagining what might be possible and then having practical ways of implementing that in the classroom, whether it is unplugged, like Joey said, or for older students, something that they can do hands-on in the curriculum. And then kind of the last thing I think is important from an industry standpoint is to not forget about those who will be doing the building of the infrastructure necessary for AI to continue to grow and advance. We talk a lot about the technical aspects of it, but these huge AI data centers need to be built, right, so that the technology can be there. I was at a conference last month, and a congressman from Pennsylvania was talking about plans to build data centers out there. But his biggest struggle as he looks at the future is right now, the folks that will start building that are likely in middle school or early high school. And so we need people who have skilled trades as part of their foundation so that this infrastructure can continue to grow and build. And so I think industry supporting that kind of education as well, and tying it to the benefit of how will this advance AI in education, AI in the workforce. I think those are some of the partnerships that could exist.
let me start by a hot take. I don't trust AI tools that don't have teachers in their development team. I think there should be teachers and educators who are part of the teams that are developing tools because they understand they have some context for what's going on the ground. Living in San Francisco, I see this often. I'll be out, and it's a dime a dozen for AI startups that are around here, and often there's a lot of hype and not a lot of evidence, and there's not a lot of context that they understand when tools are being built. But they're very good at building up this hype machine about what a tool can do, and I think an industry and education partnership really needs to have like research practice partnerships. So there's a lot of models for how do you build evidence about how something is working when you include practitioners in the process itself. Prior to this past year, there were a ton of research practice partnerships that were funded at the federal level that has supported the building of evidence alongside educators. And I think that is something that especially these AI companies can start to build out. And I think building the evidence of efficacy is really important from external entities. So individual companies are not incentivized to fund external evaluations of their work. They're incentivized to get more users to use their tools, no matter how good they are. That is kind of a bottom line with it for for-profit entities. And the federal government has drastically reduced the investment in funding of education research that would have filled that void. And so I think that there is a really big place for states and collaboratives of states to start to fund studies, big R research or little R research of the extent to which tools are working, under what conditions, and for whom. And the way that research is conducted needs to have practitioners at the table as well, building out the types of research questions, building the types of evidence. Because if you say the AI tool is working, I think one of the first questions I'm going to ask is, how? Like, under what conditions is it working? Who is it working for? How do you know? And I think there's a lot of hand waving around it. And that part is hard because the traditional way of doing research takes years, and no one wants to pay for slow research. And they shouldn't at this point. But we have to figure out ways to be able to generate evidence that allows teachers and school district leaders and parents to make informed decisions about the extent to which the tools that are being developed are really doing the things that they said they're going to.
Well, and from a boots on the ground perspective, anyone who deals with budgeting, whether it's on a site level basis with like instructional leadership teams or a district basis, you have to provide some sort of evidence that a tool is effective in order to secure funding for it and be in compliance with like how those funds are supposed to be spent. So a lot of teachers who are kind of like maybe siloed and advocating for certain tools hit that frustration point where there's just not the research yet to back up any type of positive impact pedagogically. So that was just a really great point. Thank you for sharing that. Emma, do you think you could kind of speak to how teachers and other educators and instructional leaders could kind of evaluate new tools to distinguish between sort of the shiny object and something that's truly transformative? Because, you know, in the dearth of research that we're talking about, like a lot of teachers are on their own. So what does that evaluation process look like for them?
Good question. So I think I'm going to give this from two perspectives, if that's okay, and talk about an individual educator and then from more of a district level, because I think you're going to have both people in these audiences here. But from an educator perspective, I'm going to come back to it, but make sure the tool that you're using is safe. So that may be checking with your district policies. What is the policy? If there is no policy, doing a research on your own, especially before using it with students. But I think in terms of looking at an educator, you really want to look at two areas. One, how is the AI helping you be a more productive teacher? When we first started looking at AI tools, we had teachers that were like, oh, there's this, or oh, there's this, or oh, there's this. Everyone goes through that phase of like, look at all the shiny AI tools. There's so many things they can do. And then sitting down and having them, what we ended up having do is we had educators just track. How much time is this saving you? How much would this take? How long did it take you? And start actually tracking that data. I know this is not particularly strong research, but it helped them evaluate. I wouldn't ever claim it was, but as an educator, it helped them evaluate after 2 weeks. Was this saving me time, or was I just playing with an exciting tool that did something cool? We then had them ask things for themselves of like, how is this impacting those connections I'm making with students? So is this giving me more time, and am I using that time in a way that's positive? But looking at that productivity outcome. And then for students, how is this aligned to what I'm doing in my classroom? And is it helping them learn? And so looking at more of those traditional like formative assessments. Did this improve an outcome for me in this particular space? Or was it just a cool thing that they were using? And that happened before we had our framework. When those tools, a lot of those tools started coming out, probably 2023 timeframe. Everyone was thrilled. There was tons of new tools on the scene. There still is, but there's a little bit more hype around it. And so started having them track that way. And what they found is that some tools, it was like, oh no, it just looks fun and shiny. I'm just playing with it. But yes, there was some things that I could track that were actual outcomes. And I think for an educator that may be on their own specifically, it's that trade-off, right? Your time is very valuable. And so if it is saving you time for productivity, that's awesome. And is the time giving you back helping you be a better educator? Or is it helping you actually improve those outcomes because you're designing things like more personalized resources for your students? From a district level, we actually looked at, one, we took a wide scale of what tools were actually being used. So kind of what tools educators naturally came across. We caught things a little bit early. We had our framework out, like I said, like fall of 23. So less than a year after ChatGPT. I don't know that a lot of people approached it that quickly. And so we were able to catch tools and go through an approval process with them and kind of capture that on a district end, and then say, of the approved, what's being used most. We then ran through a process of piloting. So we picked a couple of tools, and specifically for Utah, it was a little bit easier because we have a state collaborative that I organized. Someone mentioned that earlier, but we organized the state collaborative where we have all of the tech leaders across districts and our charter schools that meet on a monthly basis and talk about these things. And so part of that group organized an RFP to be able to get some tools and statewide pricing in place. So then we started looking at, what are these tools? If you're not in that space, it may be worth considering organizing something like that, because let's be honest, we're all having these conversations at dinner or somewhere, so we might as well be having them together, right? And so we looked at breaking that down, and then actually went in and looked at both usage and then high quality usage. So not just like I'm generating a worksheet, but I'm generating this particular thing in terms of areas of providing more personalization is what we looked at, depth of understanding or depth of learning in the task, and then also looked at that productivity piece. And then beyond that, actually went and collected classroom examples. So I've sat in almost 100 different classrooms and watched how they were using AI at different levels, to see if what they were doing was simply, from a technology thing, just a replacement, or actually, I'm going to come back to that word, amplifying what they did as an educator and was making a difference for students. So there's a long answer, but I feel like two perspectives there, like educator evaluate productivity versus student outcomes as a whole. Look at the depth of knowledge that you're going into. Is it safe? And then how are your educators coming back to it as well? Are they continuing to use the tool over a certain period of time?
I think that's great advice, like actionable and able to kind of like digest it. So when you go back to your classroom or your district, you can make these things happen. As we're kind of coming to the end of our time, Brian, if you could leave educators and school leaders with one piece of advice about approaching AI in education, what would it be?
I think it goes back to that phrase we've been using, is be the human in the loop, not just when using AI, but when evaluating what you want to use AI for. You have those discussions, verify both the technology that you want to use, whether it's through privacy statements or policies that the tools have, Or if you're using the tool, verify the output. So act with your critical thinking. When we think of it from a PLTW perspective, we have a activity, project, problem-based approach. And I think as you approach AI, you want to test it. You might fail with it, but then you want to iterate again and again. And so that's the evaluation process. And I think that being the human in the loop of all aspects when it comes to engaging with AI is really important.
I totally agree. I like that. Fail better next time. I like just the iterative process. Joey, how about for you? What's a piece of advice you would give to educators or school leaders around AI and education?
I really like what Brian and Emma were just saying, and I think especially educators and school leaders should be doing this together. It shouldn't be done alone. So Emma, what you were talking about are like having conversations at various levels is so important. And I think school districts should be making sense of AI use in a team, which means having different voices, students, parents, teachers, school leaders, CTOs, district technology folks, in ways that are structured but are iterative. So like the tool review group that you were mentioning is a super important step. Actually having a district set of AI guardrails that are specific to the school district is so important. And if it doesn't exist, like building that out. But I think also having a sense of how much time it would take. Like I'm thinking like for where I work at AIR, like we started our AI steering committee in 2022 and it has taken a long time. And we're an entity that uses AI and machine learning quite a bit. And it's taken a while to get to a point where I feel comfortable saying, yes, we actually have a pretty decent process to understand how do we use AI in our work and what sort of tools do we want to use for what. But that changes over time. I'm curious, Emma, like how long, like what is the runway that you've had to build this out? Because I think it's not necessarily like we're so used to just saying do this, but not necessarily how long does it take to get to that point. I'm curious from your perspective.
Yeah, let me answer that. So we started meeting as a digital teaching and learning team July of 23. We had a framework out by September, and it was pretty fast because we knew we needed the process in place before we could even look at tools. So I think that was out September of 23. Our forming committee, feedback, gathering, all of that took about until this last spring, so almost a year and a half. And that was with the conversation about the collaborative, the Utah AI collaborative that I run. That process, I think we started that in, that would have been November of 23. Because I was like, we're all having these conversations. So November of 23, and we've been meeting monthly ever since. So for the past 2 years almost. But there was a lot of support systems that I don't want to make it sound like it was like, and it magically popped out of the air, because it did not. It was a runway. It's that framework and back up, hold on. The framework there was really important first because it gave us the flexibility and those guardrails to be able to develop the policies to support. There's a difference between those two. Frameworks allow some flexibility. Policies are more hardline things like you can't use this tool if it trains on you. Things like that are policies. Frameworks we start with teaching how AI works and then this and then this. It really gave us that vision plan to be able to move some of those things quicker. So I appreciate the call out there. It didn't happen overnight. It was a process, but I think a very important process that a lot of us will need to work through.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your contributions to today's conversation. I know I've learned a ton, and I'm sure listeners will also get a lot of value out of hearing your perspectives. As we're wrapping up, where can our audience reach out to you if they have questions or if they'd like to follow up with you individually on something that you said? Emma, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So my school district has a website, canyonsdistrict.org/AI.
Awesome. And Dr. Wilson?
If you go to my organization's website, air.org, and search for Joseph Wilson, there's a contact form there. I'm also on LinkedIn. Look for Joseph P. Wilson. There's actually like 5 Joseph Wilsons that are in AI related stuff. So make sure you get the P in there to connect with me there.
Perfect. Thank you. And Brian?
Yeah, so similarly, I'm on LinkedIn. It's Brian, and I'll spell the last name for the listeners, Greiwe. So you can find me on LinkedIn. My email is my first initial last name at pltw.org. You're welcome to reach out to me there.
Amazing. Thank you so much again. We appreciate all of your time and expertise.
Now that we've heard from the experts, it's time to take it to the classroom.
This is our Boots on the Ground segment, where we talk with real educators doing real work with AI right alongside their students.
Let's hear how AI is making a difference in schools today.
Today we have Jacob Carr and Becky Keene joining us, and we are so very excited to have you both participating in this fabulous opportunity for educators to learn from other educators. Could you both briefly introduce yourselves and the educational context in which you work so that we could kind of orient ourselves?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jessica. I am an educator from the Seattle area of the United States. I've been in public education for 25 years. I'm a speaker, an author, and for the last 10 years, I've worked for a private corporation helping school systems and ed tech companies all over the world, but primarily North America, do what I believe is best practice for kids everywhere, which has been a ton of fun.
Thank you. And Jake.
Good to meet you. Thanks for having me today. I'm Jake. I'm from Northern California. I spent 16 years teaching every grade except fourth and fifth. And I ended in high school, loved it, fell in love with edu protocols and artificial intelligence. And somehow that got me noticed. And now I'm an ed tech coach at the county. And like Becky, I travel around and to make the world a better place, teaching primarily edu protocols. I'm an author in that series and artificial intelligence.
Awesome. Jessica and I are huge fans of Edu Protocols, so yay. We love all the things and what they offer to kiddos. So since you guys have both been around in a lot of places, first question is, and I'll start with you, Jacob. What AI tools have you found most useful in lesson planning or instructional design, particularly in the STEM subjects?
This is, I'm kind of bimodal in this one, maybe like others. I always lead with a nice tool, Learn-EG, Magic School AI, one of these for those reluctant people to artificial intelligence. But I really believe in getting the training wheels off as fast as possible and getting them into a frontier model. I always say if you're in a school platform, Gemini or Copilot is probably your safest large learning model for that. Some schools have gone with an enterprise version of ChatGPT and things like that. But that's what I really would say about that one when it comes to the planning and kind of the teacher as professional side of things. And also like using non-AI things along there. There's intuitive thinking tools. I love them, like design thinking. And then I took what I have in front of me and I translated into the large language model. I'm doing a little manipulatives with AI.
Thanks. Becky, how about for you? What tools have you found the most useful in lesson planning, especially in STEM classrooms?
I really enjoy eduaid.ai. I think it's a really helpful interface, the way it allows you to choose from kind of a variety of filters and options. It's set up really cleanly, and I find that it can be incredibly creative. So I'm with Jacob on really encouraging teachers to use full large language models to do their planning. However, for teachers who just want to get started, I think EduAid is an excellent entry point because it has that scaffolded interface. And again, I think they have some really creative options built in that I don't see in some of those other kind of canned easy button type tools.
Thank you so much. Teacher plates never seem to get less full. They only seem to get more full. So with that in mind, what are some ways that AI has helped reduce or streamline administrative tasks so that you can focus more on, what brings us really the most amount of joy, teaching itself? Like what kinds of ways has AI assisted with that? Becky, can we start with you?
Sure. Well, we know that educators around the world are consistently online Sunday evenings. And that's because they're looking for creative, fresh ideas to start the week. And that's the time where teachers really need that support. We also see that there is a huge dip in teacher internet use
on Friday afternoons. And a lot of times that's where they should be going home and checking out, but they're also trying to wrap up the week. And so in both of those instances, I think it's really exciting that AI tools can kind of jumpstart, right? We're giving teachers those fresh ideas on Sunday evenings. We're giving teachers maybe assistants writing their class newsletter for their week, or writing some plans for next week, or figuring out, maybe a more creative assessment for the coming week in those moments where they don't have the cognitive capacity to do more because they are overwhelmed by all of those administrative tasks. And so just simply sometimes giving them a place to get started, and then their human expertise can take over and they just can go from there, is incredibly exciting and empowering.
Becky, you bring up such the canon of amazing things that is why we need to sustain AI can help us out. I love to say that it makes the insurmountable task somewhat more doable in education, right? What I would add is this crazy ADHD brain of mine always has these weird harebrained ideals. It doesn't have time to do all of that by hand. So the way I love about AI is when I'll have this idea, like I wonder if possibly these things could get together in it. And then using it as a thought partner, ideate back and forth and find connections based. What would have absolutely done, but it would have taken a very long time. And to that end, also, when I'm diving into a new topic that I'm less familiar with, right? Like, I was an English teacher. I was an art teacher. I was a Waldorf teacher for 10 years. Like, I don't know student privacy. I do now. But what I love is some of these large language models to make deep research, or they'll call them different things. I'll use like GPT Pro deep research to pull up almost like a briefing doc to get me into a new field that I'm less familiar with. Instead of just rabbit holing around the internet. So I'll spend that time, I read the docs, then I'll know some crucial points to do that. And I think our students are doing that. So my daughter does that as a student at home.
I love that you guys were talking about like the planning. I know Edu Protocols, they talk about, slay the Sunday scaries, because I'm telling you, the Sunday scaries have been around since I first started teaching back in the dark ages before the internet, where it's like, oh Lord, it's Sunday. What am I going to do? But kind of moving it back to the relationship point of this with our students. How do you ensure that AI supports your teaching and relationships with students rather than replacing the human element of instruction? Becky, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think so much of this depends on what we believe about teaching as educators. So if my pedagogy at my core is that to learn history, for example, kids need to memorize facts and details. They need to really understand names and places and timelines. If that's my goal, then I'm probably the sort of teacher who also includes more lecture, more textbook reading, more quizzes. And I'm making a generalization, I understand. But just in general, those are some of the type of trends we see. We also see that educators who are more based around essential questions, 21st century learning design, those types of skills, then they're more apt to have more project-based, passion-based projects happening in their classroom. So those types of more holistic, student-empowered activities lend themselves to teacher relationships because they're personal and they're customized. And so when I see educators using AI as a substitute, when they're generating quizzes, they're generating worksheets, they're generating reading assignments, those are tasks that are less personal and just by nature involve less teacher-student relationship. We also are seeing the frustration around teachers that, saying that students are cheating on those types of assessments, the assessments that they've used AI to create, the students are using AI to complete them. And so I think it's an exciting place for educators to really have additional motivation to make that shift into an environment where the content, the assessments, the learning is more student-centered. It's still focused around standards, but we're approaching it completely differently. And so it's just natural that the educator would be more involved in understanding what their learners need and then guiding the tools that we have, no matter what they are, AI or not, to support student learning. So that was a little bit of a longer answer, but I feel like that question deserved it.
That's all good stuff. Jake, how about for you? What are your thoughts on making sure that the human element isn't taken out of instruction with AI?
Yeah, this is a near and dear part to me, right? The humanizing of education have always been just central to my platform. And yet I'm a heavy AI user. Some people see that as an impasse, but it really isn't. To build on maybe what Becky had talked about so eloquently, let's take something like Snorkel. Okay, Snorkel is a really cool ed tech platform. It's whiteboarding with AI feedback. So I've been rolling this out with some people that I'm coaching, and but the feedback is I get to walk around the room as just you, but prepared, right? I can't give immediate feedback to 30 kids, individual, personalized, all at the same time. But if they're getting that on the beginning level, that lower level feedback instantly, I get to walk around and interact and be like, oh, that was really beautiful what you did there. Like, oh, tell me how, ask those questions. So yeah, I lean heavily on the fact that AI will help us humanize the classroom, actually. And also we can't take away when AI does some of the heavy lifting of those really low level administrative tasks, my decision fatigue lightens. I have a better space. I have more empathy. I have more emotional intelligence about me when I'm not exhausted and frustrated and all of these things. So I see in healthy ways, AI is really truly going to build relationships in classroom. And I do caveat that in healthy ways, right? I'm afraid of the kid in front of a terminal for hours a day model. I don't think that that's where any of us want to end up. And then to build a little bit too, students understand when you are invested in them. And so when you're personalizing information, I was working with a high school student really struggling with calculus, and I taught him to take a picture of your textbook, have it translated into terms of mountain biker. The dude was an amateur pro-am mountain biker. All of a sudden, he knew I wasn't just trying to check a box and get him to learn calculus. I wanted him to actually learn because I care about it. So, yeah, that's what I would add to the empathizing and the humanizing of education through artificial reality.
Thank you so much. That's such a good example of how feedback in the moment can just shift the tide for a student. So thank you. When you're evaluating new AI tools, what criteria or red flags help you kind of decide whether a tool is worth adopting? What do you think, Becky?
I always look at student privacy and how they're handling data, number one. And I want to point out too, some of the companies will flash their fancy acronyms of, all these endorsements at the FERPA, whatever, compliant, GDRP. But that's just kind of baseline at this point. And so we really have to look beyond that and do some careful assessment of, what are they doing with that data and how are they treating student intellectual property and where is it going and is it training models and all these questions that we can be having. So that's my first just cursory question. And shockingly, not every education app is focused on that. I spoke to one at ASU GSV last year, a little startup, and they hadn't even considered making sure that their data was handled appropriately. They were in higher education, but hoping to go to K-12, and they were recording student audio. And I just said that is a deal breaker in K-12. There's no way. So just having those conversations too with vendors as we hear about these tools and just making them aware of the requirements that are true, especially in K-12, is incredibly important. And then the second thing I look for is their purpose. Personally, I'm looking for a tool whose purpose is to support student learning experiences. I actually tend to shy away from tools whose whole entire marketing campaign is based around simplifying teachers' lives. Only because I think the teachers are already really, really good at their jobs. And I know they're overwhelmed and we want to give them supports. But I also know that what I care about in education is the student learning experience. And so I gravitate toward tools that are really focused on supporting student learning, student growth, student creativity, instead of just, flashing sparkles at people and telling them that they can, generate a worksheet faster. So I tend to kind of set those aside and really look at the things that I think are going to create our students' environment into something that is really going to make them future ready.
Perfect. Thank you. And Jake, what do you look for when you're evaluating AI tools?
I'm looking for a couple of key things. First and foremost, I don't want something that's replicating where we're already at. I don't want to just translate a fill-in-the-blank worksheet to a digital space. I want it to advance education. We feel so passionately about that. So I'm really looking at things like that. I also don't want it to replace the productive struggles that a student should be going through. I want it to support that, but I don't ever want to replace that. So there's been some really beautiful work in some chatbot arenas that are doing it. I also, when I meet with these tech people, I try to help them understand they're tech people. They're not an educator, right? And so I ask them questions like, are you perpetuating the lesson models of the 90s? Because we know that large language models do that, and they have no idea, right? Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I know. And like Becky mentioned, like student privacy is you. Like you mentioned quasi-identifiers to most educators, they have no idea what you're talking about. And then when you say that back in 2000, we identified because a zip code, a birth date, and a gender can identify 81% of all adult humans in the United States. Now through artificial intelligence, there are ways of identifying students that we will never understand. And so I really look at, are you not just putting a logo for GDPR, EU compliance, HIPAA? There have been people where it's on their website, I talk to them and they would say, well, yeah, we're in process. We're in process doesn't help the ninth grader get through. So those are giant, giant red flags for me. It really has to elevate the teaching process. It has to elevate the experience of the student and not replace it. We cannot give up productive struggle, especially in our foundational years. Adults, that's a different choice they can make when they get careers. But the students have to build those the students have to build those foundational skills. And there is a struggle involved in that. We know the zone of proximate development. We cannot skip over that because it's a flashy tool.
Well, this has been a really good discussion. We're so thankfully, guys, were able to make time for us today. So as we wrap up, where could listeners find you if they'd like to continue the discussion or have some more questions? Becky, where can listeners find you?
Honestly, the best place to connect with me is through my website, beckykeen.com. It has links to all my social handles there, links to the books, the study guides, really everything you need is built in. So that's your go-to place, beckykeen.com.
And Jake, where can listeners find you?
Probably the best place is mrcarontheweb.com, 2 R's the last one. But also our What Teachers Have to Say Substack, a really interesting place right now.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of AI in education. This podcast series has been brought to you by the Utah STEM Action Center and STEM Connector. If today's conversation sparked ideas, questions, or curiosity, we've got more for you. Head over to our podcast portal for extended learning at aistemcast.com.
You'll find curated resources, classroom-ready tools, and ways to dive deeper into each episode's topic. We're building a community of educators who are ready to explore what's possible with AI, and we would love for you to be part of it.
Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and don't be afraid to dive into something new.